thank you so much for talking to us. This is a slightly peculiar, unusual.
A work of fiction. The Kingdom of Vasterland, its royal family, and all characters depicted are entirely invented and do not represent any real nation, monarchy, or living person. Behind the stone walls of Ashenmore Palace, a document has surfaced that could reshape a royal family forever. King Alaric has just uncovered a hidden clause in his mother's will, one that concerns the inheritance of his estranged son, Prince Dorian. What the late Queen Solveig left behind has stunned the household to its core. The morning began like any other in the private study of Ashenmore Palace. King Alaric sat behind the same oak desk his mother had once used for her most delicate correspondence, surrounded by ledgers, seals, and the quiet authority of a room built for difficult decisions. He had asked his solicitor for a routine review of the estate. 3 years had passed since Queen Solveig's death, and certain formalities still required closing out. Nothing about the morning suggested it would end differently than any other. His senior counsel, a woman named Ferris, who had served the crown for over 2 decades, arrived with the keeper of the privy accounts and a junior clerk carrying a leather portfolio. They expected an hour of signatures. Alaric expected the same. He put on his reading glasses, poured himself tea he would not finish, and began working through the pages: deeds, transfers, the disposition of the summer house at Calwick, the jewelry collection already divided among the household years ago. All exactly as he remembered it. He had seen these papers before. Then Ferris slid across a sealed envelope that had been filed separately, marked only with the date and the Queen's personal seal, one Alaric hadn't seen used since her final year. Inside was a single folded letter in his mother's own hand. Not the elegant, practiced script of her earlier decades, but the shakier, more deliberate handwriting of someone who knew her time was limited. The date at the top read 11 months before her death. The room went quiet as he read. His advisors watched his expression shift. First confusion, then something heavier. This was not a business document. This was a mother's final word about a son who had left, and about a grandson she clearly hadn't stopped thinking about, even as her hand grew weaker. The clause, once verified by counsel as authentic and legally binding, did something Alaric hadn't expected. It didn't simply leave money to Dorian. It attached conditions, a structure, almost a negotiation, reaching from beyond the grave. Ferris confirmed the document had been properly witnessed years earlier and filed under seal, with instructions that it not be opened until a full estate review had been conducted, meaning the Queen had planned, quite precisely, for this exact moment to occur only after the initial shock of her death and the transition of power had settled. She hadn't wanted this used as ammunition in the raw, early days of a new reign. She'd wanted time to pass first. Alaric set the letter down and pressed his fingers to his temples. He thought of his mother at Calwick in her final autumn, composing this in secret, sealing it, and saying nothing, not even to him. Had she known exactly how this scene would play out? Of course she had. She had always thought several moves ahead. That had been the entire architecture of her reign. The provision set aside a meaningful sum from the Queen's private estate, not enormous by royal standards, but substantial enough to matter, for Prince Dorian, her grandson, who had left royal life 5 years earlier under circumstances that had fractured the family publicly and painfully. But the money came with strings, each one revealing just how carefully she had thought this through. The first condition required Dorian to spend a set number of weeks each year within Vasterland or among its allied territories, engaged in some form of charitable or public service work. Not a demand that he return to formal royal duties, which the Queen seems to have understood he would never accept, but a requirement that he remain meaningfully tied to the country and its people rather than disappearing from it entirely. The second addressed his 2 young children. A portion of the funds was earmarked specifically for their upbringing and education, to be overseen by trustees agreed upon by both Dorian and the reigning monarch, a built-in mechanism, deliberate or not, that would force father and grandfather into ongoing contact. The Queen had written, in her own hand, that her great-grandchildren should not grow up as strangers to the land of their family, whatever had gone wrong between the adults. Attached to the legal language was a personal letter to Alaric alone, meant to be read only when the clause was found. In it, Solveig didn't pretend the estrangement was simple or that Dorian was blameless. She wrote that she understood the hurt in the family, the public accusations, the humiliation, the sense of betrayal that had spread through the household like a slow poison. But she also wrote, in words that Alaric would return to again and again in the days that followed, that Dorian was still her grandson, that his children were still hers too, and that she refused to leave the world without trying, one last time, to keep them from being lost completely. She had written that bridges burned can sometimes be rebuilt, but only if both sides are willing to carry material to the site. Her inheritance clause, she said plainly, was her attempt to supply some of that material. What Alaric and Dorian chose to build with it, or whether they built anything at all, would be entirely up to them. The legal team confirmed there was no ambiguity in the drafting. The Queen had worked with her most trusted advisor to make sure the language would hold up to any challenge. This wasn't a wish that could be quietly set aside. It was enforceable, deliberate, and unmistakably hers. To understand why Queen Solveig built this into her will requires looking back at her relationship with Dorian, which had always carried a different texture than her relationship with her other grandchildren. He made her laugh. He had a restlessness and an irreverence that reminded people close to her of her own youth, before decades of duty had worn every spontaneous edge down to something smoother and more careful. His decision, 5 years earlier, to step back from royal life alongside his wife Talia had blindsided the household. Not because he wanted a different life, people close to the Queen said afterward, but because of how abruptly and publicly the decision had been announced, leaving the institution scrambling to respond. Solveig had been hurt, but even in that hurt, those closest to her insisted her primary concern had never shifted from Dorian's well-being. The public interview that followed months later, where Dorian and Talia spoke openly about feeling unsupported, isolated, and at times mistreated by the institution, had wounded the Queen in a different way. She was, in many respects, the institution herself, and criticism of it landed as something close to criticism of her. Her public response had been measured, diplomatic, the kind of careful non-answer that satisfied no one and offended everyone equally. But privately, according to those who knew her, she never fully closed the door. She and Dorian spoke by phone, occasionally throughout the years that followed. Not often, but often enough that the thread never quite snapped. She made clear to him, in the particular way grandmothers manage to say difficult things gently, that she loved him regardless of what he'd chosen, even if she didn't agree with all of it. In her final year, as her health declined, those around her described a woman quietly settling her affairs and making peace with what she would leave unresolved. The rift with Dorian sat near the top of that list. She had navigated the country through decades of change, held together institutions far larger and more complicated than her own family. And yet this one relationship, remained unfixed, and it haunted her more than anyone realized at the time. The clause was drafted in the final year of her life, during a stretch when several things converged at once. Her health was failing, Dorian and Talia showed no signs of returning even briefly, and a major national anniversary was approaching that Dorian was unlikely to attend. In that context, the Queen seems to have decided that words and family meetings, which had already failed repeatedly, would not be enough. She reached instead for the one instrument she still fully controlled, her will. Sitting alone with the letter in his private study, Alaric faced a problem that was both intensely personal and quietly constitutional. The personal side was obvious enough. This was his mother's dying wish concerning his son, a young man he loved and had also, at times, been furious with and hurt by. But as king, nothing he did in response would stay purely private. Whatever path he chose would send a signal about the kind of reign he intended to lead. His relationship with Dorian had deteriorated sharply since the split, the interviews, the memoir that followed with its unflinching criticism of Alaric as a father. All of it had cut deeper than he let anyone see. He'd spent his whole life building the composure required of a monarch, but criticism from your own child, aired publicly, finds the gaps in even the thickest armor. The anger was real. So was the love. They sat together uncomfortably, refusing to cancel each other out. His elder son, Prince Corwin, heir to the throne and considerably less forgiving than his father about Dorian's departure, would need to be told before anything moved forward. Alaric arranged a private conversation with him the next day, both out of respect and necessity. A public rift between king and heir over how to handle Dorian would hand the press exactly the kind of drama that weakens a monarchy from the inside. The conversation was difficult. Corwin listened, his jaw tight, and when Alaric finished, his response was immediate. Their grandmother had overstepped. She had no right, in his view, to bind the family to conditions requiring reconciliation with someone who had spent years publicly attacking them. Alaric let him speak without interrupting. He understood the anger. He felt a version of it himself. But he also understood his mother well enough to know this hadn't been about control. It had been, in her own quiet way, a final act of hope. No agreement was reached that day. Corwin made his position clear. If Alaric chose to honor the clause fully, he would not obstruct it, but he would not warm to it either. He would be civil where required and nothing more. The wounds, as far as he was concerned, ran too deep for a legal document to close. Beyond the family, Alaric had to weigh how the public would receive any of this. Opinion on Dorian was already split. Some viewed him sympathetically, a young man who had chosen his own life and mental health over an institution that demanded too much. Others saw him as ungrateful, someone who had taken the privileges of his birth and then profited from tearing down the family that gave them to him. An inheritance with conditions attached could read as touching and human, or it could read as a monarchy trying to buy back a wayward son with strings that made the gesture feel more like leverage than love. His advisors split down predictable lines. The older generation, loyal to Solveig's memory, urged him to honor her wishes fully and without hesitation. The younger ones worried about precedent, about optics, about whether honoring the clause would make Alaric look controlled by his mother's will even in death. Late that night, alone in his study, Alaric thought about the countless times his mother had guided him, corrected him, occasionally overruled him outright. She had not been a perfect woman, and she had made her share of mistakes, but her devotion to family, messy, stubborn, and inconvenient as it sometimes was, had never once been in question. This clause was her last piece of guidance, delivered from somewhere he could no longer reach her to ask follow-up questions. Ignoring it felt, to him, like the one betrayal he wasn't willing to commit. Thousands of miles away, in a coastal house far removed from Ashimore, Dorian had no idea any of this was unfolding. His life since leaving royal duties had settled into something that looked nothing like his old one and yet, in its own way, carried a similar weight of public performance. Media projects, public appearances, a constant negotiation between his past and his present. His relationship with his father had cooled into something functional but distant. Brief calls about the children, unavoidable appearances at major family events, little warmth exchanged in between. The idea of an inheritance clause requiring him to spend weeks each year back home would not be a small ask. It would mean stepping back into an environment he and Talia had deliberately left, and re-exposing themselves to scrutiny they'd worked hard to escape. Talia's willingness to support regular returns was far from guaranteed. She had spoken publicly about feeling unsafe and unwelcome during her time in the royal household, and asking her to revisit that regularly would test the life they'd built together. The provision concerning their children, trustees requiring the king's approval, expectations about time spent connecting with heritage, might feel to them less like a gift and more like an attempt at continued control from across an ocean. And yet, buried somewhere under the defensiveness Dorian had built over years of public conflict, his grandmother's letter might land differently than anything else the family had sent him. She had never been part of the conflict in the way his father and brother had. She had remained, through everything, a source of steadiness. Learning that she'd spent her final year quietly trying to build him a way back might crack something open that years of tension had sealed shut. Alaric's advisors ultimately recommended a measured approach, a formal legal notification outlining the inheritance and its terms, paired with a short, personal letter from Alaric himself. Not a plea, not a demand, just an open door, and an acknowledgement that his mother had wanted this more than either of them had realized. The likely outcome, most agreed, would be neither swift acceptance nor outright rejection, but negotiation, a slow, imperfect back and forth over terms, mediated by lawyers, shaped by two people who loved each other, and had also hurt each other badly enough that trust would need to be rebuilt in inches rather than leaps. Whatever happened next, one thing was clear. Queen Solveig had left her family something they hadn't had before, not a solution, but a structure. A framework within which reconciliation was at least possible, if anyone involved was willing to try. Whether they would remain the open question hanging over Ashenmore Palace as the year went on, a family suspended between old pain and whatever came next, holding in their hands both a burden and quite possibly a gift.